The ring wouldn't come off. Natalie Ellis stood in the courthouse corridor, fingers slippery with the lavender hand soap from the restroom where she'd scrubbed her hands 3 times trying to work up enough suds to ease the platinum band past her knuckle. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like trapped wasps, and somewhere down the hall a baby was crying, but all she could focus on was Marcus standing in front of her with his hand outstretched and that familiar expression of entitled impatience creasing his face. "I'm not leaving without it, Nat." He said it like she was being unreasonable, like she was the one who'd shown up at his apartment unannounced 6 months ago to find him and her former best friend tangled up on the couch they'd picked out together at IKEA, like she was the one who'd dragged them both through an annulment instead of just signing the papers quietly. The ring was stuck at her knuckle, swollen from stress and too much coffee and not enough sleep. She twisted it harder, feeling the metal bite into her skin. "I'm trying," she said, hating how small her voice sounded in the tall, ceilinged hallway. Her lawyer had already left, briefcase swinging, muttering something about another appointment. Marcus's lawyer stood a few feet behind him, checking his phone with studied disinterest. "Try harder." Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice to that particular tone he used when he wanted to seem patient but was actually furious. "That ring cost me 4 months' salary. You don't get to keep it when you're the one who made this whole thing a circus." She'd made it a circus, not him. Not the affair, or the lies, or the way he'd tried to convince everyone, including her own mother, that Natalie had been neglectful, cold, too focused on her work at the art gallery to pay attention to his needs. The annulment had gone through an hour ago, the judge's signature still wet on the paperwork tucked into her purse. And here she was in the hallway, letting Marcus Donnelly make her feel 2 inches tall one last time. The ring turned a fraction. Her knuckles screamed. She pulled harder. "Allow me." The voice came from her left, low and accented in a way she couldn't immediately place. European, maybe, but older than that, the vowels shaped by something that predated modern borders. Before she could turn toward it, cool fingers wrapped around her wrist. Not cold, precisely. Cool the way marble stayed cool even in summer, like the temperature was simply intrinsic to the substance rather than a response to environment. The touch was gentle but absolutely certain, and when she looked up she forgot how to breathe. The man standing beside her was tall enough that she had to tilt her head back despite her heels. His hair fell past his shoulders in a sheet of pure white that should have made him look old, but instead made him look ageless, otherworldly, like he'd stepped out of a pre-Raphaelite painting. His skin had the same colorless quality, pale as frost, and his eyes were the dark gray of storm clouds, fixed on her hand with an intensity that made her pulse jump. He wore a black suit that looked hand-tailored, probably cost more than her car, and moved with the kind of absolute physical confidence she'd only ever seen in dancers or professional athletes. When he slid the engagement ring off her finger in one smooth motion, she barely felt it. "Hey," Marcus started, but the white-haired man was already holding the platinum band up to the light, examining it with the detached interest of someone appraising a museum piece. "Subpar craftsmanship," he said mildly. "The prongs are uneven. The center stone has an inclusion at 4 o'clock. He looked at Marcus for the first time, and something in that gaze made Natalie's ex take an involuntary step backward. "You should demand a refund." Then, before anyone could respond, before Natalie's thoughts could catch up to what was happening, the stranger took her left hand in both of his and slid something else onto her ring finger. It was lighter than the engagement ring, more delicate, but the weight of it seemed to settle into her bones anyway. Silver, she thought at first, but when she looked down she realized it was white gold, or maybe platinum, worked into an intricate design that resembled a crown wrapping around her finger. Tiny stones she couldn't identify caught the fluorescent light and threw it back in colors that shouldn't exist, deep violets and blues that seemed to glow from within. "What the hell?" Marcus's voice had gone up half an octave. "That's not give me the actual ring. What is this? Some kind of joke?" The white-haired man dropped Marcus's engagement ring into his palm without looking at him, attention still focused on Natalie's hand. His thumb brushed across the crown ring he'd just placed there, and she felt the touch like a spark of static electricity. "No joke," he said quietly. "A clarification." "A what?" Marcus sputtered. Who even are you? Natalie, do you know this guy? She didn't. She absolutely didn't. She would have remembered someone who looked like a fallen angel and moved like death in expensive clothes. But when the stranger's eyes met hers, something in them made her hesitate, made her think that maybe she should know him, or that she would, or that it didn't matter because the knowing was happening right now in this terrible courthouse hallway, and that would be enough. We should go, the man said, still speaking to her, only to her. This place is depressing. Marcus grabbed her arm. You're not going anywhere with some random... The stranger didn't raise his voice. He didn't even move, really. But something shifted in the air around them, a pressure change like the moment before lightning struck, and Marcus's hand fell away from Natalie's arm as if it had been burned. You claimed you wanted the ring, the man said, his tone still mild, almost pleasant. You have it. Our business is concluded. The lawyer behind Marcus had stopped pretending to look at his phone. He was staring at the white-haired stranger with an expression Natalie couldn't quite read: recognition, maybe, or fear, or some complicated mixture of both. Mr. Hadrian, the lawyer said carefully, I didn't realize you were involved in these proceedings. The stranger Hadrian apparently didn't acknowledge him. He was already guiding Natalie down the corridor with a hand at the small of her back, that cool touch somehow perceivable even through her blazer and blouse. She should stop, should ask questions, demand explanations, probably call security. Instead, she found herself matching his stride, her heels clicking against the marble floor in rhythm with his footsteps, the crown ring on her finger catching the light from the tall windows they passed. Behind them, Marcus was shouting something, but the words didn't land. They slid off her like water off waxed fabric, meaningless and distant. They pushed through the courthouse doors into autumn sunshine that made her blink after the artificial light inside. A car was waiting at the curb. Not a car, actually. A vehicle that made her think of words like automobile instead, all glossy black paint and chrome details that belonged in a different era. The driver stood beside the rear door, and when Natalie saw him properly, her steps faltered. He had the same white hair, the same frost-pale skin, the same ageless quality, though his features were sharper, his build more compact. He opened the door without speaking, and Hadrian gestured for her to precede him. I don't understand what's happening, Natalie said. The first full sentence she'd managed since this stranger had appeared beside her like an answer to a question she hadn't known how to ask. I know. Hadrian's expression softened slightly, something that might have been regret or sympathy flickering in those storm-gray eyes. I apologize for the abruptness, but I couldn't. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I couldn't stand there and watch that creature humiliate you for one more second. You don't even know me. No, he agreed. But I know what it looks like when someone is being made to feel ashamed of something that was never their fault. And I have strong feelings about allowing such things to continue. A breeze picked up, sending leaves skittering across the courthouse steps. Natalie looked down at the ring on her finger, at the crown design that seemed even more elaborate in natural light. What is this? She asked. A royal signet, Hadrian said. My royal signet, to be precise. She waited for the punchline. When it didn't come, she looked up at him and found him watching her with an expression of such serious intensity that her breath caught. You're joking. I assure you I am not. He glanced at the courthouse behind them, at the doors where Marcus and his lawyer were visible through the glass, arguing with security. But this is neither the time nor the place for a full explanation. Please, allow me to take you somewhere more comfortable, and I will answer every question you have. Every instinct she'd developed over 28 years of life was screaming at her not to get into a car with a strange man, no matter how beautiful or well-dressed or capable of making her ex-husband shut up with a single look. But her hand was still tingling where he'd touched it, and the weight of the crown ring felt right in a way Marcus's diamond never had, and she was so tired of making the safe choice, the responsible choice, the choice that left her standing in courthouse corridors getting yelled at by men who'd never deserved her in the first place. She got in the car. The interior was as elegant as the exterior, all leather that smelled like it had been tanned sometime around the Renaissance and wood polished to a mirror shine. Hadrian slid in beside her, and the driver closed the door with a soft click that sounded expensive. As they pulled away from the curb, Natalie saw Marcus burst through the courthouse doors, his face red, still shouting. Then they turned a corner, and he disappeared from view, and she felt something in her chest unclench for the first time in months. "Where are we going?" she asked. "My home," Hadrian said. "Unless you'd prefer somewhere public, a restaurant perhaps?" She thought about sitting in some trendy cafe trying to have this conversation over overpriced lattes while other patrons eavesdropped. "Your home is fine." He inclined his head slightly, and she noticed for the first time that he moved with an almost geometric precision, like every gesture had been calculated for maximum efficiency. Not robotic, there was too much grace for that, but deliberate, controlled. They drove in silence for several minutes, leaving downtown behind for older neighborhoods where the houses sat far back from the street behind iron gates and mature trees. Eventually, the driver turned onto a private road that wound up a hill Natalie hadn't even known existed within city limits. The house at the end of the drive made her breath catch. It wasn't a house, not really. It was something between a manor and a small castle, all gray stone and tall windows, somehow managing to look both medieval and impeccably maintained. Ivy climbed the walls in careful patterns, and the grounds stretched out in all directions, professionally landscaped but designed to look wild. "You live here," Natalie said flatly. "In the city. This entire estate just exists in the middle of the city, and I've never heard of it." "Privacy is important to me," Hadrian said, as the car stopped in front of a set of carved wooden doors that looked like they'd been salvaged from a cathedral. "To my family." The driver opened her door, and she stepped out onto cobblestones that were probably older than the country. Up close, the house was even more impressive. Gothic Revival architecture executed with the kind of budget that didn't require compromise. Hadrian led her inside without ceremony, through an entrance hall that featured a chandelier the size of her first apartment and a staircase that swept upward in a graceful curve. Everything was dark wood and deep colors, burgundy and navy and forest green, but instead of feeling oppressive, it felt cocooning, safe. He brought her to a library that occupied what must have been the entire east wing, floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with books in every language she recognized and several she didn't. A fire burned in a fireplace large enough to stand in, and through the windows she could see the city spread out below them, distant enough to feel like a painting. "Sit, please," Hadrian said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs flanking the fireplace. "Would you like tea? Something stronger?" "Something stronger," Natalie said immediately, sinking into the chair. The leather was butter-soft and warm from the fire. He moved to a sideboard and poured 2 glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. When he handed her one and their fingers brushed, she felt that same coolness, that same sense of absolute surety. She took a sip. Whatever it was burned pleasantly all the way down and tasted like it cost more per ounce than her rent. Hadrian settled into the chair across from her, somehow managing to look both relaxed and coiled, like a cat pretending to nap. The firelight caught in his white hair and turned it gold at the edges. "I am," he said without preamble, "a vampire. I have been for approximately 600 years. I am also a king, though my kingdom exists somewhat outside the boundaries of human geography. The ring I gave you is a royal signet, and by placing it on your finger I have, according to the laws of my people, made a formal claim of protection and potential binding, which means effectively that I have just told every vampire in this territory that you are under my direct care, and that any who harm you will answer to me personally." Natalie took another drink, a longer one this time. "Okay," she said. Hadrian blinked. It was the first time she'd seen him look even slightly uncertain. "Okay? I mean, it's insane. But today has been insane. 6 months have been insane. You showing up and making Marcus actually shut up and then bringing me to your secret castle and pouring me excellent whiskey is," she gestured vaguely with her glass, "honestly, it's the least insane thing that's happened recently." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, the first real change in his expression since they'd met. It transformed him, made him look less like carved marble and more like something that had once been human, might still remember being human. "You're taking this remarkably well," he observed. "I'm in shock," Natalie said honestly. "Ask me again in an hour and I'll probably be screaming, but right now I'm just tired. So tired. And you're either telling the truth, in which case vampires exist and my entire understanding of reality needs updating, or you're an incredibly rich eccentric with an elaborate fantasy, in which case at least you have good taste in real estate." She looked down at the ring again, turning her hand so the strange stones caught the firelight. "Why did you do it? Really?" The smile faded. Hadrian was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire with an expression that made him look every one of his 600 years. 2 centuries ago," he said finally, "I was bound to another vampire. It wasn't love, but it was significant. A political alliance that became something more complex. We exchanged rings, made proclamations before both our courts. And then, when it suited her purposes, she called me to her throne room and demanded I return her token in front of every noble in the territory. She made it a spectacle, had me kneel, had me place the ring in her palm while her courtiers whispered and laughed." His hand tightened slightly on his glass. "She did it to humiliate me, to prove that she could, and it worked. I wore that shame for decades before I finally let it calcify into anger and then eventually into simple policy. I told myself I would never again stand by and watch someone be stripped of their dignity in public, that if I had the power to prevent it, I would." Natalie's throat felt tight. "So when you saw Marcus demanding the ring back, I saw you standing there trying to hurt yourself to comply, trying to make yourself smaller to satisfy someone who'd already taken enough." Hadrian looked at her directly, and the intensity in his gaze made her shiver. "And I thought, not again. Not while I'm standing here watching." She swallowed. "That's actually kind of incredible. It was also impulsive and has created a number of political complications I'll need to address." He said it wryly, like he was admitting to a minor social faux pas rather than apparently binding himself to a complete stranger according to supernatural law. "What kind of complications?" "The kind where my court will expect an explanation for why I've given my signet to a human woman I'd never met before today. The kind where certain factions who already question my judgment will see this as proof that I've become irrational, and the kind where—" He hesitated, something that might have been old pain flickering across his features. "Where the vampire who humiliated me 200 years ago will almost certainly learn about this and find it very interesting. Is she dangerous? Extremely, though not in the ways you might think." Hadrian leaned forward slightly. "I need you to understand something, Natalie. By accepting that ring, even unknowingly, you've become part of vampire politics. There are those who will see you as a weakness to exploit, a puzzle to solve, or a statement to interpret. I can protect you. I will protect you, but your life has just become considerably more complicated than it was an hour ago." She should tell him to take the ring back. Should run screaming back to her normal life of gallery openings and disappointing her mother and trying to figure out how to be a person again after the Marcus disaster. This was crazy. This was several levels beyond crazy. But when she thought about going back to her apartment, to sleeping on the couch because she still couldn't make herself use the bed she'd shared with Marcus, to another month of pitying looks from her co-workers and helpful suggestions from her sister about dating apps and fresh starts, when she thought about that and then looked at Hadrian, at this beautiful, impossible creature who'd stepped in and stopped her humiliation with the kind of casual authority that suggested he could stop anything he wanted to, who was looking at her now like she mattered, like her answer mattered. "Tell me about the binding," she said. "The potential binding. What does that actually mean?" Something shifted in Hadrian's expression. Not quite hope, but attention, focus, like she'd said exactly the right thing. "Among vampires, a royal signet represents intention," he said carefully. "By giving you mine, I've indicated that I intend to bind myself to you to take responsibility for you, to defend you, potentially to court you if you were willing. It's not the binding itself, not yet. That would require both parties' consent and a formal ceremony. But it's a public declaration of serious interest. And if I just gave you the ring back? Then the declaration would be void, and you could return to your life as it was. He said it evenly, no pressure in his tone. I would ensure your memories were adjusted so none of this troubled you. You could do that? Change my memories. Not personally, but I have people who specialize in such things. He paused. I won't, though, not without your permission. Despite the mess I've created, you deserve autonomy in how we address it. Natalie turned the ring on her finger again, feeling the precise craftsmanship, the weight of whatever those strange stones were. In the firelight, they seemed to pulse gently, like they had a heartbeat of their own. What was her name? She asked. The vampire who humiliated you? Seraphine Valamont. And you think she'll come after me if I keep this? I think she'll find the situation fascinating and insert herself into it in whatever way causes the most interesting chaos. Hadrian's expression was difficult to read. Seraphine doesn't do things by halves, and she has a particular talent for finding people's wounds and pressing on them. If she learns I've given my signet to a human woman, she'll want to understand why. And she won't be subtle in her investigation. But you could protect me. Yes. And this binding thing, if we did it, what would that actually involve? Hadrian went very still. Are you considering it? I'm considering not going back to my apartment, Natalie said. The whiskey was making her brave, or maybe just honest. I'm considering that in the last hour, you've made me feel more seen and valued than Marcus did in 2 years of marriage. I'm considering that my life was pretty thoroughly ruined already, so what's a little vampire politics on top of that? Natalie. I'm also considering, she continued, that you're clearly dealing with your own damage, and that maybe this isn't about me at all. Maybe I'm just a convenient excuse for you to work through something with your ex. The words came out harsher than she'd intended, but she needed to say them, needed to see how he'd react. Hadrian didn't flinch. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You're not wrong, he said. When I saw you in that corridor, there was absolutely an element of projection, I suppose you'd call it. I saw my own humiliation reflected in yours, and I reacted. But he leaned forward again, and now there was nothing uncertain in his gaze at all. But from the moment I touched your hand, from the second I saw you close enough to really see you, it stopped being only about Seraphine. You looked at me like I was insane, but you got in the car anyway. You're sitting here asking practical questions about vampire politics instead of dissolving into hysterics. You're sharp and you're brave and you're calling me on my wounds instead of just accepting my help at face value. He reached across the space between them, not touching her, but holding his hand out, palm up, an offer. I can't promise this won't be partially about old scars, he said quietly. But I can promise that you're not just a convenient excuse. You're Natalie Ellis. You just got free of a man who never deserved you. And if you're willing to let me, I would very much like to give you the kind of protection and respect he should have offered from the beginning. Her hand was moving before she'd consciously decided, reaching out to take his. That cool touch again, but she was ready for it this time, and underneath the marble smoothness she could feel something else, a vibration like a purr, like power running through him too vast to be fully contained. I have conditions, she said. Name them. First, you don't make any decisions about my memories without asking me, even if you think it's for my own good. Agreed. Second, you tell me the truth about all of it. Vampire politics, this Seraphine person, what the binding actually means, everything. Agreed. Third, she squeezed his hand. You let me help. With whatever this complication is, I'm not going to just hide in your castle and let you handle everything while I wait around being protected. Hadrian smiled, a real smile this time that showed teeth slightly too sharp to be human. That one might be more difficult, but yes, agreed. They sat there for a moment, hands clasped, the fire crackling beside them and the whole impossible situation settling into something that felt almost like a decision, almost like a choice she was making with full knowledge and clear eyes. So what happens now? Natalie asked. Now, Hadrian said. "I need to inform my court that I've made a formal claim and begin preparing for the political fallout. You need to decide where you'd like to stay for the next few days. Here would be safest, but I understand if you'd prefer somewhere else. And we both need to prepare for Seraphine to make her entrance, because I guarantee she already knows about this and is planning something spectacular." "How would she already know?" "Because Marcus's lawyer recognized me. He's human, but he does work for vampire clients occasionally. By now he'll have told someone who told someone else, and information travels very quickly in our world." Natalie pulled her hand back, suddenly needing the space to think. "You said your court would expect an explanation. What are you going to tell them?" "The truth." Hadrian stood in one fluid motion and moved to the window, looking out over the darkening city. "That I encountered a woman being humiliated by someone she'd trusted, that I intervened on impulse, and that having met her, I find I have no regrets about the impulse." "That's going to go over well?" "Not remotely." He glanced back at her, and there was something fierce in his expression now, something that reminded her he was a king, that he'd been ruling and fighting and surviving for 6 centuries. "But I've spent 200 years being cautious and measured, and making sure every decision could withstand scrutiny. Perhaps it's time I remembered what it felt like to simply act because something mattered." The sky outside was turning purple with dusk, and as Natalie watched, lights began to come on across the estate grounds, subtle landscape lighting that made the whole place glow like something out of a fairy tale. "I'll stay here," she said, "for now, until we figure out what's actually happening." Hadrian turned from the window, and the relief on his face was so naked, so genuine, that it made her chest ache. "Thank you," he said simply. A knock at the library door interrupted the moment. The driver from earlier entered, though he'd changed out of his uniform into dark slacks and a white shirt that made his pale coloring even more striking. "My lord," he said with a slight bow, "Lady Seraphine has requested an audience." Hadrian went very still. "When?" "She's at the gate now. She says she'll wait as long as necessary, but she would prefer not to wait at all." Natalie stood up. "That was fast." "She was always efficient." Hadrian looked at the driver. "Tell her she may enter. Bring her to the blue salon somewhere formal. And wake Lucian. I want him present for this." The driver bowed again and disappeared. Hadrian ran a hand through his white hair, the first genuinely agitated gesture Natalie had seen from him. "I should have known she'd come immediately," he muttered. "She never could resist an opening." "Do you want me to hide?" Natalie asked. "Or would that look worse?" He looked at her sharply, then laughed, a short, surprised sound. "You're remarkable. No, hiding would be pointless. She knows you're here. She knows I gave you the signet. Hiding would just make us look uncertain. You should be present, visible, wearing the ring where she can see it." "Okay." Natalie's heart was hammering. "Okay. So I just sit there, look significant?" "Essentially." Hadrian crossed to her in 3 long strides and took both her hands, looking down at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Seraphine will try to unsettle you. She'll say things designed to make you doubt yourself, doubt me, doubt this entire situation. She's brilliant at finding people's insecurities and weaponizing them. If it becomes too much, you can leave. No one will think less of you, but you'd prefer I stayed. I'd prefer you did whatever makes you feel safest. But yes, if you can bear it, having you there would—" He paused, seeming to struggle for words. "It would mean something. To her. To the others who will hear about this. It would make the claim real in a way it isn't if you're just a human I've hidden away somewhere." Natalie thought about Marcus, about all the times he'd asked her to make herself smaller, quieter, less, about how she'd done it because she'd thought that was what love required. "Then I'll stay," she said. "And I won't make it easy for her." The smile Hadrian gave her was absolutely worth whatever chaos was about to unfold. The blue salon turned out to be a receiving room done in shades of navy and silver, with furniture that looked like it had been built for vampire proportions, everything just slightly too tall, too elegant for human comfort. Hadrian took a seat in what was clearly a position of authority, a high-backed chair that might as well have been a throne. He gestured for Natalie to take the seat to his right, a position that she suspected was also significant. 2 other vampires had appeared, both with the same distinctive white hair and pale skin. One was the driver, who stood at attention near the door. The other was taller, broader through the shoulders, with features that reminded her of Renaissance paintings of warrior angels. He positioned himself behind Hadrian's chair, silent and watchful. "Lucian," Hadrian said quietly, gesturing to the tall vampire. "My captain of the guard. He's been with me for 400 years. Lucian inclined his head to Natalie but didn't speak. His eyes, she noticed, were a lighter gray than Hadrian's, almost silver. They didn't have to wait long. The door opened, and a woman entered who made every other beautiful thing Natalie had ever seen immediately irrelevant. Séraphine Valemont was slightly taller than Natalie, willowy and perfect, with white hair that fell to her waist in a straight sheet like spilled moonlight. Her skin had the same frost-pale quality as the other vampires, but on her it looked deliberate, like she'd chosen to be carved from ice. She wore a dress that was probably illegal in several jurisdictions, black and fitted and cut to display exactly how devastating she was. Her eyes were dark gray, almost black, and when they fixed on Natalie, she felt like she was being catalogued, assessed, and filed away for future use. "Lysander," Séraphine said, her voice pitched low and intimate. "It's been too long." So his first name was Lysander. Natalie filed that away, trying not to think about how the name suited him, how it sounded like something out of mythology. "Séraphine." Hadrian's voice was absolutely neutral. "I'm surprised to see you in my territory. I thought you preferred Paris this century." "I do, but when I heard you'd done something impulsive and potentially catastrophic, I simply had to investigate." She glided across the room, moving with a grace that made Natalie feel like a particularly clumsy elephant. "And here we are, you looking determinedly unmoved, surrounded by your loyal guards, and—" Her gaze slid to Natalie. "This must be the human who's caused such a fuss." "Natalie Ellis," Natalie said before Hadrian could speak. "Nice to meet you." Seraphine's eyebrows rose a fraction. "How delightfully bold. Tell me, Natalie Ellis, do you have any idea what you've gotten yourself into?" "Not entirely," Natalie admitted, "but I'm learning fast." A smile played at the corner of Seraphine's mouth. She looked at Hadrian, and something passed between them. Some communication Natalie couldn't interpret. "She's charming," Séraphine said. "I can see the appeal. Though I'm curious, Lysander, is this actually about her, or is it about me?" "The world doesn't revolve around you, Séraphine." "No, but your damage does." She settled onto a sofa across from them, crossing her legs with deliberate elegance. "You've spent 2 centuries being the perfect king. Measured, diplomatic, never letting personal feelings interfere with politics. And now suddenly you're handing out royal signets to humans you've just met in courthouse corridors? That's not growth, darling. That's a trauma response." Natalie felt Hadrian tense beside her. She reached over without thinking and placed her hand on his arm, a silent message of support. His hand immediately covered hers, that cool touch grounding. Séraphine noticed. Of course she noticed. Her smile widened. "Oh," she said softly. "Oh, this is even better than I thought. You actually like her." "My feelings are irrelevant," Hadrian said coldly. "I've made a formal claim. Under our laws, that claim is valid regardless of motivation." "True, but your court won't see it that way. They'll see their king making impulsive decisions based on old wounds and current attractions, and they'll wonder if you're still fit to rule." Séraphine leaned forward slightly. "I could contest the claim, you know, on grounds that it was made without proper deliberation, that the human didn't understand what she was accepting, that you were acting under emotional duress." "You could try," Lucian said from behind Hadrian's chair. His voice was deep, quiet, absolutely deadly. "It would be entertaining to watch you fail." Séraphine laughed, a sound like bells made of crystal. "I've missed you too, Lucian. Still loyal unto death, I see." "You have not stated your purpose for this visit," Hadrian said. "If you've simply come to needle me about my choices, you've succeeded. If you intend to actually contest the claim, do so formally. Otherwise—" "Otherwise what? You'll throw me out of your house?" Seraphine's expression turned sharp. I'm here because I'm genuinely curious, Lysander. 200 years ago I humiliated you, and you've spent the time since then locked away in your castle like a wounded animal. Now you've suddenly decided to engage with the world again, and your first act is to claim a human woman you don't know. That's fascinating. That's the kind of behavior that makes me think you're either having a breakthrough or a breakdown, and I'd very much like to know which. The room had gone very quiet. Natalie could feel the tension radiating from Hadrian, could sense how close he was to saying or doing something he'd regret. "Can I ask a question?" she said. All eyes turned to her. Seraphine looked amused, Lucian surprised, Hadrian wary. "Why did you do it?" Natalie asked, looking directly at Seraphine. 200 years ago. Why humiliate him publicly? What did you gain? Seraphine tilted her head, studying Natalie with new interest. "What makes you think I gained anything?" "Because you seem too smart to be casually cruel. If you humiliated him in front of your entire court, you did it for a reason. So what was it?" For the first time since entering the room, Seraphine's expression shifted into something that might have been genuine. "He was going to leave," she said quietly. "Our alliance had run its course. We both knew it. But he was going to be the one who walked away. He was going to make it clean and dignified and mutual, and then he was going to disappear back to his territory and leave me looking like I'd failed to hold his interest." She looked at Hadrian, and there was something old and complicated in her eyes. "I couldn't allow that. So I made it ugly, made it public, made sure that when the story was told, I was the one who'd ended things, not you. It was petty and vindictive, and I've regretted it approximately." She paused, considering. 3 times in the last 200 years. Only 3? Hadrian's voice was tight. "I have very high standards for regret." Seraphine turned back to Natalie. "Does that answer your question?" "It explains the action," Natalie said. "Not sure it justifies it." "I wasn't looking for justification. You asked what I gained control of the narrative. Sometimes that's worth the cost." Seraphine stood in one fluid motion. "I'm not going to contest your claim, Lysander. Despite what you apparently think of me, I'm not actually interested in destroying you. But others will question it. Lord Vashel, for one. He's been positioning himself as your rival for the last century, and this is exactly the kind of ammunition he needs." "Vashel is always looking for ammunition," Hadrian said dismissively. "He's been challenging me since before you and I met. Yes, but he's gotten stronger, built alliances, and he's been very vocal about his belief that you've been too withdrawn, too isolated, too wrapped up in old pain to rule effectively." Seraphine moved toward the door, then paused. "If he challenges your claim, it won't be in court. It'll be under the old laws, personal combat to determine fitness." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Lucian shifted his weight, and Natalie saw his hand move to his side where a weapon probably hung when he wasn't in the salon. "He wouldn't dare," Lucian said. "Wouldn't he? He's been looking for an excuse to call Lysander out for decades. This gives him one." Seraphine looked at Hadrian, and for a moment, Natalie saw something that might have been actual concern flash across her features. "He'll frame it as protecting vampire interests from human contamination, say that giving a royal signet to a mortal shows dangerously compromised judgment, and under the old laws, if he issues formal challenge, you have to answer." "Then I'll answer," Hadrian said flatly. "I've fought Vashel before. Not in the last 100 years, not since he learned that lovely trick with the ashwood weapons." Seraphine's gaze flicked to Natalie, then back. "Just be careful. Please, I may have done you wrong 2 centuries ago, but I don't actually want to see you destroyed." She left before anyone could respond, the door closing behind her with a soft click that somehow felt louder than a slam. The silence stretched out for several long seconds. Finally, Hadrian released Natalie's hand and stood, pacing to the window with restless energy that suggested he was fighting to maintain his composure. "Who's Vashel?" Natalie asked. "An old enemy," Hadrian said without turning around. "He challenged my right to rule 300 years ago, argued that I was too young, too inexperienced. I defeated him in combat and allowed him to keep his territories out of respect for his age and former status. He's resented me for it ever since. And now he might challenge you again because you gave me a ring." Because I made a choice without consulting the court first, yes. Hadrian turned to face her, and his expression was carefully blank in a way that told her he was feeling too much to show any of it. I'm sorry. I pulled you into this mess, and now you're going to be the excuse for vampire politics at its worst. Natalie stood and crossed to him, her heels clicking on the marble floor. Stop apologizing. I chose to get in the car. I chose to stay. I'm choosing this. You don't understand what this means. Then explain it to me. She put her hand on his chest, feeling the absolute stillness there, the lack of heartbeat that should have been disturbing but somehow wasn't. You promised me the truth, remember? So tell me what happens if this Vashel person challenges you. Hadrian covered her hand with his, holding it against his chest like he was trying to remember what a heartbeat felt like. Formal challenge under the old laws means combat to submission or death. It would be held before both courts, public and binding. If I win, my claim on you is validated, and Vashel loses significant status. If I lose, he paused. If I lose, the claim is void, Vashel becomes king, and you become vulnerable to anyone who wants to make a point about human involvement in vampire affairs. So we have to make sure you win. I've been fighting for 600 years. Vashel is older, more experienced, and apparently has new tricks. Hadrian's jaw tightened. I'm not afraid of him, but I'm also not arrogant enough to assume victory is guaranteed. Lucian cleared his throat. My lord, there may be another option. They both turned to look at him. He shifted uncomfortably under the attention, clearly not used to offering unsolicited advice. If you completed the binding before Vashel issues formal challenge, the claim would be significantly harder to contest, Lucian said carefully. A potential binding can be challenged as impulsive or inappropriate. An actual binding, freely entered into by both parties, is nearly impossible to overturn under our laws. No, Hadrian said immediately. Natalie barely understands what's happening. I'm not going to pressure her into a permanent bond just to shore up my political position. What does the binding actually involve? Natalie asked. You said it would require both parties' consent and a ceremony, but what does that mean in practical terms? Hadrian looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. It means a blood exchange and formal vows before witnesses. Once completed, we'd be bound not in the human marriage sense, but connected. I would know if you were in danger, be able to find you anywhere, feel your strongest emotions. You would have similar awareness of me plus certain protections. Other vampires wouldn't be able to harm you without answering to me, and you'd age much more slowly. Eventually, if you chose, you could transition to vampire fully, though that would be your decision alone. So it's like marriage but more intense. Much more intense and permanent. There's no vampire divorce, Natalie. Once bound, we're bound until one of us dies truly, and vampires are very difficult to kill. She turned that over in her mind, trying to imagine being connected to someone forever, feeling their emotions, sharing their immortal life. A day ago it would have sounded like a nightmare. Now, looking at Hadrian's careful expression, at the way he was so obviously trying not to influence her decision. How long do we have before Vashel would challenge you? Days, maybe. A week at most if he wants to build support first. Hadrian stepped back, putting physical distance between them like he was afraid his proximity might sway her. But I'm not going to ask you to bind yourself to me permanently just to avoid a political fight. I'll handle Vashel the old-fashioned way if it comes to that. And if you lose, I won't. But if you do, I become vulnerable. And you probably die. Or at least lose your crown. She looked down at the ring on her finger, at the crown design that seemed to glow even in the salon's soft light. Seems like completing the binding would solve multiple problems at once. Natalie. I'm not saying yes yet, she interrupted. I'm saying it's an option we should consider seriously. You said you wanted to give me the kind of protection and respect I deserved. Well, I want the same for you. If binding to me would protect you from a challenge based on compromised judgment, then we should at least talk about it. Hadrian was staring at her like she'd just offered to fight Vashel herself. You've known me for 3 hours. And in those 3 hours, you've shown me more genuine care than my ex-husband did in 2 years. She moved closer to him again, close enough to see the silver flecks in his gray eyes. Look, I'm not saying this isn't crazy. It absolutely is. But my alternative is going back to my apartment and my ruined life and my mother's disappointed phone calls. This vampire politics and dangerous challenges and binding ceremonies, at least this feels like it matters. At least here, I'm not just the woman who couldn't keep her husband interested. You were never that, Hadrian said fiercely. Your ex-husband was an idiot who didn't deserve you, and his failure to recognize your worth says everything about him and nothing about you. See, you say things like that and then wonder why I'm considering permanently binding myself to you. She smiled, trying to lighten the intensity. Can I have time to think about it? Really think, not just react. Of course, as much time as you need. He caught her hand, the one wearing his ring, and raised it to his lips in a gesture that should have been corny, but instead made her breath catch. I meant what I said earlier. You're not just an excuse or a chess piece. If we do this, I want it to be because you genuinely want it, not because you feel trapped or obligated. I know, she said softly. That's why I'm actually considering it. Lucian cleared his throat again. My lord, we should prepare for Vachel's next move regardless. I'll increase security on the estate and send word to our allies in court. Do it, Hadrian said, still looking at Natalie, and prepare the guest wing. Natalie will need somewhere comfortable to stay while she's here. The guest wing turned out to be larger than Natalie's entire apartment, a suite of rooms decorated in soft grays and creams with a bathroom that looked like it belonged in a luxury hotel. Someone had already brought her purse from the car, and she found it sitting on a dresser that was probably an antique worth more than her annual salary. She sat on the bed, a massive 4-poster thing with curtains that could actually close for privacy, and tried to process the last few hours. This morning she'd woken up in her cramped apartment, dreading the annulment hearing. Now she was in a vampire castle wearing a royal signet and contemplating a permanent magical bond with a 600-year-old king. Her phone buzzed. 17 missed calls from Marcus, 12 texts that she didn't bother reading, and 3 voicemails that could stay unheard forever as far as she was concerned. Her sister had also called twice, probably having heard about the courthouse scene through the gossip network that was her mother's book club. She should call someone. Should tell her sister she was safe, let her mother know she wasn't dead in a ditch. But what would she even say? Hi, Mom. Don't worry. I'm just staying with a vampire king I met today. Yes, vampires are real. No, I don't think it's a cult. Talk soon. A soft knock on the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. When she opened it, she found a woman standing in the hallway with an armful of clothes. The woman had the same white hair and pale skin as the other vampires, but her features were softer, more approachable. She looked like someone's favorite aunt, if that aunt happened to be an immortal blood drinker. Miss Ellis, I'm Mira. Lord Hadrian asked me to bring you some things you might need. She held up the clothes. We guessed at your size, but vampires are generally quite good at that sort of estimation. Natalie stepped back to let her in. Thank you. I didn't exactly pack a bag when I left the courthouse. I imagine not. Mira set the clothes on a chair and turned with a gentle smile. It must be very overwhelming. If you need anything, food, toiletries, someone to explain how the shower works because it's unnecessarily complicated, just pick up that phone. She pointed to an actual antique telephone on the bedside table. It connects to the house staff. There's house staff? Quite a few of us, yes. Lord Hadrian prefers to employ vampires who need safe haven for whatever reason. I came here a century ago after some unpleasantness in Vienna. He gave me work and protection, and I've been grateful ever since. Mira moved toward the door, then hesitated. He's a good man, Miss Ellis. I know this situation is strange, but he truly does try to do right by people, even when it costs him. After Mira left, Natalie examined the clothes she'd brought, several outfits in different styles, all in her size exactly as promised, ranging from casual to formal. Someone had thought to include comfortable pajamas, which felt absurdly considerate given everything else happening. She showered, The shower was indeed unnecessarily complicated, featuring approximately 12 different nozzles and a control panel that looked like it belonged on a spaceship, and changed into soft leggings and an oversized sweater. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Same face, same dark hair falling past her shoulders, but something in her expression had changed. She looked alert instead of tired, present instead of numb. The ring caught the light as she dried her hair, and she paused to really examine it for the first time. The crown design was incredibly intricate, each tiny detail perfect, and those strange stones seemed to hold entire galaxies inside them. It was beautiful and clearly valuable, but more than that, it felt significant. Like wearing it meant something beyond just politics or protection. Another knock, this one heavier. When she opened the door, Hadrian stood in the hallway looking uncertain in a way that made him seem more human, more vulnerable. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said. "I wanted to make sure you had everything you needed." Mira said she brought clothes. "She did, thank you." Natalie leaned against the doorframe. "Do you always hover outside your guests' rooms looking worried?" A slight smile. "Only when the guest is wearing my royal signet and being targeted by vampire politics because of my impulsive choices." "So just me then." "So far, yes." They stood there for a moment, the hallway stretching out in both directions, candlelight from actual candles flickering in sconces along the walls. It felt like something out of a Gothic novel, beautiful and slightly unreal. "Have you eaten?" Hadrian asked. "I realized we offered you whiskey but not actual food, which seems negligent given that humans need regular meals." "I'm not particularly hungry." The stress of the day had killed her appetite. "But I wouldn't mind company, if you're not busy with Vampire King stuff." "Vampire King stuff can wait." He offered his arm like they were in a period drama. "May I show you the grounds? It's a clear night and the stars are visible despite the city lights." She took his arm, feeling the cool solidity of him through his sleeve, and let him lead her through the maze of hallways and down a sweeping staircase to a set of French doors that opened onto a terrace. The grounds spread out before them, illuminated by landscape lighting that made everything look enchanted. They walked in silence for a while, following a path that wound through formal gardens just starting to fade into autumn dormancy. The air was cool but not cold, and somewhere in the distance she could hear water running, probably a fountain. "Tell me something about yourself," Hadrian said eventually. "Something that has nothing to do with vampires or ex-husbands or any of this chaos." Natalie thought about it. "I work at an art gallery. Contemporary pieces mostly, though we do some classical acquisitions. I've always loved how art can capture a moment, preserve something that would otherwise be lost to time." "That's why you do it? To preserve moments?" "Partly. Also because standing in a room full of beautiful things makes the world feel less heavy." She glanced up at him. "I imagine you understand that, living in a place like this." "I do, though I'll admit my appreciation for beauty has become somewhat complicated over the centuries. When you've seen empires rise and fall, when you've watched everything you knew transform into something unrecognizable, beautiful things start to feel either precious or futile depending on the day." "Which do they feel like today?" "Precious," he said immediately. "Definitely precious." They reached the fountain, an elaborate marble thing featuring what looked like Greek gods in various states of dramatic positioning. Water cascaded from multiple levels, catching the moonlight. "Can I ask you something?" Natalie said. "About the binding." "Anything. If we did it and I'm still not saying yes, this is purely hypothetical, what would it feel like? The connection between us?" Hadrian was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Imagine knowing someone well enough that you could sense their moods from across a room. Now intensify that and remove the distance requirement. I would know if you were happy, frightened, angry, in pain. You'd have similar awareness of me, though potentially less intense since you'd still be human. It's not mind-reading thoughts remain private, but emotions are largely shared." "That sounds incredibly intimate." "It is. It's why most vampires only bind once, if at all. Having someone that close, that connected, for eternity, it requires absolute trust." "Do you trust me?" Natalie asked. Really? After 3 hours? I trust who you've shown yourself to be in those 3 hours, Hadrian said. You could have run screaming. You could have given back the ring and demanded to forget all of this. Instead, you asked smart questions, called me on my wounds, and offered to help protect me from my own political consequences. That tells me more about your character than years of casual acquaintance might. She turned to face him fully, looking up at his face in the moonlight. I'm scared, she admitted. Not of you, exactly, but of making another huge mistake. I married Marcus because I thought I was supposed to, because he seemed stable and safe and like the kind of choice a responsible adult makes. It was wrong from the beginning. I just didn't want to see it. What if this is the same thing? What if I'm just running from one disaster into another? Hadrian reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in both hands. That cool touch again, but gentle, reverent. Marcus was never safe, he said quietly. He was small and cruel and made you doubt yourself. There's nothing safe about that. This us potentially is dangerous in entirely different ways, but I will never make you feel small. I will never make you question your worth. Even if you decide tomorrow that you want nothing to do with me or vampire politics, that much I can promise you. She leaned into his touch without meaning to, exhaustion and emotion and too much change catching up with her all at once. I don't want to decide tomorrow. Then don't. Take all the time you need. But Vachel, I've survived 600 years of vampire politics. I'll survive Vachel's challenge if it comes to that. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone in a gesture so tender it made her throat tight. You are not responsible for protecting me, Natalie. I'm the one who pulled you into this. Maybe I wanted to be pulled. The words came out barely above a whisper. Maybe standing in that courthouse corridor trying to get Marcus's ring off felt like drowning, and you showing up felt like air. Something shifted in Hadrian's expression, and for just a moment she saw past the careful control to the want underneath, the loneliness of 200 years spent isolated by old pain. He leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to move away, and pressed his forehead to hers. Tell me what you need, he breathed. I don't know yet. She closed her eyes, just breathing in the moment, the cool night air and the sound of the fountain and the impossible feeling of safety she had no business feeling. But I'll figure it out. We'll figure it out. They stood there for a long time, wrapped in quiet and moonlight, while somewhere in the city below, her ex-husband probably raged, and somewhere in vampire territory Vachel probably plotted, and somewhere Seraphine probably watched and waited to see what would happen next. But right now, in this moment, none of that mattered as much as the simple fact of Hadrian's hands on her face and the decision she hadn't made yet, but could feel herself moving toward with every second that passed. The next morning brought coffee delivered to her room by Mira, along with fresh pastries and a note in elegant handwriting. Court session at noon. Your presence would be appreciated, but not required. L. Natalie ate breakfast sitting in the window seat of her room, watching the grounds in daylight. Everything looked even more impressive in the sun, the gardens sprawling and immaculate, the house itself a masterpiece of stone and glass. She could see staff moving around below all vampires, she assumed, given the pale hair and graceful movements. At 11:30, she dressed in one of the more formal outfits Mira had provided, a fitted dress in deep burgundy that made her feel elegant and slightly dangerous. She left her hair down and made sure the ring was visible on her left hand. Lucian was waiting in the hallway when she emerged. He bowed slightly, that gesture of respect she was still getting used to. Miss Ellis, I'm to escort you to the court chamber if you've decided to attend. I have. She fell into step beside him as they navigated the hallways. Can you tell me what to expect? Lord Hadrian will be addressing concerns from the court about his claim on you. There will be questions, likely some hostility. Vampires can be... He paused, searching for the right word. Traditional in their views about human involvement in our affairs. But you're okay with it? With me being here? Lucian glanced at her, his silver eyes unreadable. I've served Lord Hadrian for 4 centuries. In that time, I've watched him retreat further and further from engagement with anything beyond basic governance. He stopped attending social functions, stopped forming new alliances, stopped allowing anyone close. Seraphine's betrayal broke something in him, and he spent 200 years being competent but cold. He paused at a set of ornate double doors. Yesterday he acted on impulse to help a stranger. Today he's preparing to defend that choice before the entire court. That's the most alive I've seen him in longer than I can remember. So, yes, Miss Ellis, I'm okay with you being here. The doors opened before she could respond, revealing a chamber that took her breath away. It was circular, rising up 3 stories with a domed ceiling painted with elaborate frescoes. Rows of seats descended toward a center floor where Hadrian stood beside what could only be described as a throne carved from black stone and inlaid with silver. Vampires filled the seats, 50 or 60 of them, all white-haired and pale, all watching as she entered with Lucian. The murmuring that had filled the space died instantly. Hadrian's eyes found hers across the room, and she saw relief flash across his features before he schooled them back to careful neutrality. He gestured to a seat near the throne, another position of significance, she suspected. She walked down the center aisle with her head high, feeling every vampire's gaze on her like a physical weight. When she reached Hadrian, he took her hand and brought it to his lips, making absolutely sure everyone in the room saw the ring on her finger. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. "Just for her." Seemed important. "It is." He helped her into the seat, then took his position on the throne. The change in him was immediate. The uncertain man from last night disappeared, replaced by a king who'd ruled for 6 centuries. He surveyed the assembled court with absolute authority. "We have matters to address," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the chamber. "I'm aware there are questions about my recent actions. Speak them now, and I will answer." A vampire stood from the front row, older looking than the others, his white hair braided intricately. "My lord, with respect, the court was not consulted before you gave your royal signet to a human. This is unprecedented." "It is my signet to give, Lord Corvus. I was not aware I required permission." "Not permission," another vampire said, this one a woman with features sharp enough to cut glass. "But explanation, certainly. We are your court, your advisors. Decisions that affect the stability of your rule affect us all." "Then let me explain." Hadrian leaned forward slightly. "I encountered Miss Ellis in a moment of private humiliation. Her former husband was demanding she return her engagement ring in public, making a spectacle of her compliance. I chose to intervene. I chose to offer her protection under our laws, and I would make the same choice again without hesitation." "Because she reminds you of your own humiliation?" a male voice called from the back. "Because Seraphine once shamed you and now you're projecting that old wound onto every human woman you encounter?" The chamber erupted in murmurs. Hadrian's expression didn't change, but Natalie felt the temperature drop several degrees. "Who speaks?" Hadrian's voice was soft, dangerous. A vampire stood from the upper tier, younger than some of the others, with a cruel set to his mouth that Natalie immediately disliked. "I do, my lord, and I think I speak for many when I say this seems less like protection and more like unresolved trauma seeking an outlet." "Lord Vashel," Hadrian said, and Natalie's stomach dropped. "How kind of you to share your psychological assessment. Though I'm curious, when did you complete your training in vampire mental health?" A ripple of laughter ran through some of the assembled vampires, but Vashel didn't smile. "I speak only from observation, my lord. You've been withdrawn for 2 centuries. Now suddenly you're making grand gestures on behalf of humans you don't know. It suggests instability." "It suggests," Hadrian said coldly, "that I grew tired of allowing fear of public opinion to dictate my choices. But if you'd like to challenge my judgment formally, Lord Vashel, our laws provide mechanisms for that." The chamber went absolutely silent. This was it, Natalie realized. The challenge Seraphine had warned them about, playing out in real time. Vashel smiled, and it wasn't pleasant. "Are you inviting formal challenge, my lord?" "I'm stating fact. If you believe my judgment is compromised to the point of affecting my fitness to rule, you have the right to issue challenge. Otherwise, you're simply expressing an opinion I don't particularly value." Before Vashel could respond, Natalie stood. Every eye in the chamber swiveled to her, and she felt the weight of their attention like a physical force. But she'd sat through enough gallery board meetings with entitled collectors to know how to hold a room. "May I speak?" she asked, looking at Hadrian. He looked surprised but nodded. "Of course." She turned to address the court, trying not to think about how insane this was. "I'm Natalie Ellis. I'm 28 years old. I work at an art gallery. And yesterday I finalized an annulment from a man who spent 2 years making me feel like I was never quite good enough." When Hadrian she used his first name deliberately, claiming familiarity, offered me protection. I didn't understand what it meant. I still don't fully understand vampire politics or why a ring matters so much or what half of you are really concerned about. She looked directly at Vashel. "But I understand being judged for choices other people don't approve of. My ex-husband's family thought I was too focused on my career. My mother thought I was too passive in the relationship. Everyone had opinions about what I should do differently, and you know what? All those opinions just made me smaller, more uncertain, more willing to doubt myself." She turned back to Hadrian, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "In less than 24 hours, this man has made me feel seen and valued in ways I'd forgotten were possible. Maybe that's trauma responding to trauma. Maybe it's impulsive and inadvisable. But it's also the first choice I've made in years that felt like it was actually mine. So if you want to challenge his judgment, that's your right. But leave me out of your reasoning. I'm not some helpless human he's projecting onto. I'm a person making decisions about my own life." The silence after she finished was absolute. Then, from somewhere in the middle tiers, someone started clapping. Others joined in, slowly, until roughly half the chamber was applauding, while the other half sat in stony disapproval. Hadrian stood and crossed to her in 3 quick strides, taking her hand. "Well said," he murmured, and the pride in his voice made her feel 10 feet tall. Vashel was still standing, his expression dark. A pretty speech, but it changes nothing about the fundamental question: is our king fit to rule when he makes significant political decisions based on emotion rather than strategy? "I challenge your premise," Hadrian said, still holding Natalie's hand. "Offering protection to someone in need isn't emotional weakness. It's the most fundamental responsibility of power, using it to shield those who can't shield themselves. If you disagree, if you truly believe I've become unfit, then issue your formal challenge, and we'll settle this according to the old laws." Vashel's smile widened. "Very well. I, Lord Vashel Theron, do formally challenge King Lysander Hadrian's fitness to rule on grounds of compromised judgment and emotional instability. I invoke the right of combat under the old laws, to be held 3 days hence before both courts." The chamber erupted in conversation, vampires standing and talking over each other. Lucien appeared at Hadrian's side, his hand on his weapon, expression grim. Hadrian raised one hand and the noise cut off immediately. "Challenge accepted. 3 days, traditional weapons, combat to submission." He looked at Vashel with absolute calm. "I hope you've been practicing." The court session dissolved after that, vampires filing out in clusters, some stopping to speak with Hadrian in low voices, others casting curious or hostile glances at Natalie. She stayed at his side, feeling out of her depth but determined not to show it. When the chamber finally cleared except for Lucian and Mira and a few other vampires she didn't recognize, Hadrian turned to her. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Speak on my behalf." "I know. I wanted to." She was still holding his hand, she realized. When had that become automatic? Was it okay? I wasn't sure about protocol or... He kissed her, just leaned down and captured her mouth with his, cool lips and careful pressure and a tenderness that made her forget they were standing in a vampire court chamber surrounded by supernatural politics. When he pulled back, his eyes had darkened to almost black. "It was more than okay. It was perfect. You were perfect." "My lord," Lucian said carefully, "we should discuss preparation for the challenge." "Later," Hadrian said, not looking away from Natalie. "First, I need to make sure Natalie understands what she's just witnessed." He led her from the chamber to a smaller room she hadn't seen before, something between an office and a library with comfortable furniture and walls lined with books. Once the door closed behind them, he pulled her into his arms properly, just holding her. "Vashel will try to kill me," he said quietly. "Combat to submission technically allows for the loser to yield, but he won't let me yield, and I won't give him the chance. One of us will die." Natalie's hands fisted in his shirt. "You said you could beat him." "I said I'd try, but he's older, more experienced, and apparently has new techniques I haven't seen. The outcome isn't guaranteed." "So what do we do?" "We could complete the binding," he said. "If we're bound before the combat, it strengthens my claim significantly. Makes it clear this wasn't just impulsive but mutual and considered. It might not stop the challenge, but it would undermine Vashel's argument about compromised judgment." "Would it help you win the actual fight?" "No, but it would protect you if I lose. A completed binding means you'd be under permanent protection of vampire law. Vashel couldn't touch you even if he became king." Natalie pulled back enough to look up at him. "You're suggesting we bind ourselves together permanently just to protect me if you die?" "I'm suggesting we consider all options." "What about the option where you just win?" A slight smile. "That's definitely my preferred scenario." "Mine too." She took a breath, trying to organize her thoughts. "Okay, here's what I'm thinking. We have 3 days. Use them to prepare for the fight, train, or strategize, or whatever vampire kings do to get ready for combat. If, at the end of those 3 days, you genuinely think binding would make a difference to the outcome or the aftermath, we'll talk about it seriously. But I'm not going to rush into a permanent magical bond just because we're scared." "We?" "Yes, we. You think you're the only one who's scared right now?" She touched his face, feeling the cool, smooth skin, the sharp architecture of his cheekbones. "I just watched someone challenge you to a fight to the death. I'm terrified, but I'm also not making life-altering decisions while terrified if I can help it." Hadrian caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "You're extraordinary. I'm practical. There's a difference. You're both." The next 3 days passed in a blur of controlled chaos. Hadrian spent hours each day in a training room Natalie hadn't known existed, working with Lucian and other guards on combat techniques and strategy. She watched sometimes from the gallery above, trying not to wince every time he took a hit or went down hard. Vampires fought differently than humans, faster, more brutal, with a disregard for injuries that would incapacitate anyone mortal. Hadrian moved like violence made elegant, all precise strikes and calculated risks, but even to her untrained eye, she could see when Lucian scored a point or found an opening. "He's good," Mira said, appearing beside Natalie during one of these observation sessions. "Better than Vashel in pure technique, but Vashel fights dirty, and he's had 100 extra years to learn tricks." "That's not reassuring. It's not meant to be. It's meant to be honest." Mira handed her a cup of tea. "You could stop this, you know." "How?" "Complete the binding. It wouldn't prevent the challenge, but it would change the stakes significantly, make it less about Hadrian's judgment and more about Vashel's ambition." Natalie wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "Everyone keeps suggesting that like it's a simple solution. Because in our world it is. Binding is serious, but it's not uncommon. Many vampires bind for political reasons, strategic alliances." "Is that what you think this is? Political?" Mira smiled. "I think it started as Hadrian's trauma response and has become something more complicated. I also think you're stalling because you're afraid of making another mistake like your marriage." "That obvious?" "Only to someone who's been alive long enough to recognize the pattern." Mira settled into the seat beside her. "Can I tell you something? I was bound once very long ago before I became vampire. I married young, to a man my family chose, and I spent 20 years in a relationship where I was never quite enough. When I was turned unwillingly, that's the unpleasantness in Vienna I mentioned, I gained the power to leave. And the first thing I did was run so far and so fast I ended up on another continent." She sipped her own tea, watching Hadrian and Lucian circle each other below. "I swore I'd never bind myself to anyone again. It took me a century to realize I was confusing binding with being bound. One is a choice. The other is a trap. And you think binding to Hadrian would be a choice. I think you've already chosen him," Mira said gently. "You've just not admitted it yet." That night, Natalie found Hadrian in the library, reading by firelight. He looked up when she entered and immediately set the book aside. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "Too much thinking." She settled into the chair across from him. "Tell me about the combat. What actually happens?" "We fight in a designated circle before both courts. Traditional weapon swords usually, though the challenged party gets to choose. No magical enhancements, no outside interference. First one to submit or die loses." "And you're confident?" "I'm competent. Confidence feels presumptuous." He leaned back, studying her. "You could stay away. You don't have to watch. Would you want me there?" "Selfishly, yes, but I'd understand if... Then I'll be there." She twisted the ring on her finger, a habit she developed over the past 3 days. "I've been thinking about the binding." Hadrian went very still. And I think Mira's right. I think I've already chosen you. I've just been too scared to admit it." She met his eyes. "But I need you to be honest with me. If I weren't a strategic advantage, if binding to me didn't help your political position at all, would you still want it?" "Yes." No hesitation, no calculation. "The politics are noise, Natalie. What I want is you here, safe and connected to me in ways that mean something. I want to know if you're happy or hurting. I want the right to stand between you and anything that tries to harm you. I want centuries to learn everything about you, your favorite foods and how you look when you first wake up and what makes you laugh until you can't breathe." He stood and crossed to her chair, kneeling so they were eye level. "I want you to bind to me because you want it too, not because it's strategic or protective or any other practical reason. Just because being connected to each other feels right." Natalie's eyes were burning. "That's a pretty good answer." "It's the truth." She took his face in both hands. "Then let's do it. The binding. Before the combat. Not because it's strategic, but because I want you to fight Vashel, knowing I chose you. Fully. Permanently." The smile that broke across Hadrian's face was incandescent. He surged up and kissed her properly, deeply, with 600 years of loneliness, finally finding an answer. She kissed back just as hard, pouring 3 days of fear and wanting into it. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, despite only one of them needing air, Hadrian pressed his forehead to hers. "We'll do the ceremony tomorrow night," he said. "That gives us a day before the combat to adjust to the bond. Is that acceptable?" "Perfect. You'll need to understand what it entails, the blood exchange, the vows, what it will feel like when the bond settles. Then teach me." They spent the rest of the night in the library while Hadrian explained the binding ritual in detail. It was more complex than she'd expected, specific words that had to be spoken, a ceremonial cup they'd both drink from, witnesses who'd stand for the bond's legitimacy. But underneath the ritual was something simple. 2 people choosing each other, permanently. "Will it hurt?" she asked as the fire burned down to embers. "The blood exchange can be intense. Not painful exactly, but overwhelming. You'll feel my life force mixing with yours, sense my age and power and all the centuries I've lived. It can be disorienting for humans. But then we'll be connected." "Then we'll be bound," he corrected. "Connected is temporary. Binding is forever." Forever. The word should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like relief. The next evening, Natalie dressed in a gown Mira had somehow procured, white silk that flowed like water, simple and elegant. Someone had woven small crystals into her hair, and when she looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked like she belonged here, in this impossible castle with these impossible creatures. The ceremony was held in a small chapel on the estate grounds, something Hadrian had mentioned was original to the property, built in the 14th century and maintained ever since. It was beautiful in its simplicity: stone walls, stained glass windows, and an altar that had probably seen thousands of rituals over the centuries. Lucienne and Mira stood as witnesses, along with a few other vampires Hadrian trusted. Seraphine had sent a note saying she'd be there, in spirit, which Natalie suspected was her way of being supportive, without actually having to watch her ex-lover bind himself to someone else. Hadrian wore all black, severe and beautiful, his white hair loose around his shoulders. When Natalie entered the chapel and saw him standing there waiting for her, something in her chest settled into absolute certainty. This was right. This was what choosing for herself looked like. The ritual itself was surprisingly simple. They stood facing each other at the altar, while Lucian read the traditional words in a language Natalie didn't recognize, Old French maybe, or something even older. Then Hadrian produced a small ceremonial knife and a crystal cup. "Your hand," he said quietly. She offered her left hand, the one wearing his ring. He drew the knife across her palm in one quick motion, sharp pain, bright and brief, and let her blood drip into the cup. Then he cut his own palm and added his blood to hers. The mixture in the cup should have been red. Instead, it swirled with colors that shouldn't exist, the same impossible purples and blues as the stones in her ring. "The vow," Lucian prompted. Hadrian took the cup in both hands and met her eyes. "I bind myself to you, Natalie Ellis, freely and fully. I offer my protection, my loyalty, and my life in service of your happiness and safety. What was mine alone becomes ours. What was separate becomes unified. I choose you, now and always." He drank from the cup, then offered it to her. Her hands only shook a little as she took it. "I bind myself to you, Lysander Hadrian, freely and fully. I offer my trust, my partnership, and my life in service of your happiness and safety. What was mine alone becomes ours. What was separate becomes unified. I choose you, now and always." The liquid tasted like copper and lightning and something vast that her human mind couldn't quite categorize. As soon as she swallowed, the world tilted. Heat flooded through her veins, followed immediately by ice, followed by something that was both and neither. She felt Hadrian catch her as her knees buckled, felt the solid coolness of him, but she was also feeling things that weren't hers, the weight of centuries, the memory of battlefields and courts and endless nights, the loneliness of 200 years spent isolated, and underneath it all, a fierce joy at her presence that nearly stopped her heart. "Breathe," Hadrian murmured against her hair. "Just breathe through it. It will settle." She couldn't breathe, could barely think past the flood of sensation and emotion and foreign memories that weren't memories. They were just impressions, echoes of 600 years of life pouring into her consciousness. But she could feel him too, his steadiness, his calm certainty, and she grabbed onto that like an anchor. Slowly, incrementally, the world stopped spinning. The overwhelming flood of his existence became a steady presence at the back of her mind, accessible but not intrusive. She could feel his concern for her, his careful control to keep from overwhelming her further, and underneath that the deep contentment of finally not being alone. "Okay," she gasped. "Okay, I'm okay." He pulled back enough to look at her, and she could feel his relief like it was her own. Could feel the love underneath the concern, vast and patient and absolutely certain. "The bond is complete," Lucian said formally. "Witnessed and sealed. May it bring you both strength and peace." Mira was crying, Natalie noticed. The other vampires were smiling, genuine happiness on their ageless faces. Hadrian kissed her forehead, her cheeks, finally her mouth, gentle kisses that she felt twice, once from the outside and once from the inside through the bond, his joy magnifying her own until she was dizzy with it. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like I just drank the universe." She laughed shakily. "Also like I might fall over." "The intensity will fade as you adjust." He guided her to sit on the altar steps, keeping her close. "But the connection stays. You'll always be able to sense me now, find me anywhere, know if I'm in danger." "Good." She leaned against him, feeling his arm come around her. "That means I'll know you're okay during the combat tomorrow." The mention of the fight sobered everyone in the chapel. Tomorrow Hadrian would face Vachel in front of both courts, and binding or not, the outcome wasn't guaranteed. But tonight, in this small chapel with these witnesses, Natalie let herself just feel the bond settling into place, this new awareness of Hadrian's presence that felt right in ways she couldn't articulate. She'd spent 2 years married to Marcus and never felt a fraction of this connected. Now, she'd known Hadrian for 4 days and couldn't imagine being separate from him. I love you, she said quietly. Not because the bond demanded it, or because the situation required it, but because it was simply true. Through the bond, she felt his surprise, his fierce joy, his own love rising up to meet hers. I love you too, he said against her hair. My queen. The combat was held at sunset the next day in a courtyard Natalie hadn't seen before, a perfect circle of white stone surrounded by tiered seating. Both courts attended Hadrian's vampires on one side, Vachel's on the other, with neutral parties scattered throughout. Seraphine sat in a position of prominence, wearing crimson and looking like she was attending the theater rather than a potentially fatal challenge. Natalie sat in the place of honor, beside Hadrian's empty throne, Lucian standing behind her like a guard. She wore a dress in deep blue, and Hadrian's ring caught the dying light with every movement. The bond hummed in her chest, a constant awareness of Hadrian somewhere close preparing for combat. She could feel his focus, his calm determination, and underneath that, a fierce protectiveness directed at her. He'll win, Lucian said quietly. He has more to fight for now. Does that actually matter in combat? Everything matters in combat, especially what you're fighting for. Vachel entered first, walking to the center of the circle with a confidence that made Natalie's stomach clench. He wore minimal armor. Vampires healed too fast for armor to matter much and carried a sword that looked ancient and deadly. His supporters cheered as he raised the blade in salute. Then Hadrian appeared, and the noise from his side of the court drowned out everything else. He'd chosen a lighter sword, more rapier than broadsword, and he moved with that predatory grace she'd come to associate with him. When his eyes found hers across the courtyard, she felt the bond pulse with warmth. I love you, she mouthed. Through the bond, fierce joy, absolute certainty, and then a wall as he locked down his emotions to focus entirely on the fight. A vampire she didn't recognize neutral party presumably stepped into the circle between them. The challenge is issued and accepted, he intoned. Combat to submission or death under the old laws. Begin. They began. Natalie had watched Hadrian train, thought she understood how vampires fought. She'd been wrong. This was different, faster, more vicious, with a precision that came from centuries of practice. Vachel struck first, a testing blow that Hadrian parried easily. They circled, trading strikes that came so fast Natalie could barely track them. The first blood went to Hadrian, a slice across Vachel's arm that would have been crippling on a human but barely slowed the older vampire. Vachel responded with a low strike that got past Hadrian's guard and opened a line along his ribs. Through the bond, Natalie felt the pain spike, felt Hadrian's immediate compensation as the wound began healing. She gripped the arms of her seat, forcing herself to stay still and watch. They fought for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Both were bleeding from multiple wounds, both moving with fractionally less speed as exhaustion set in. Vachel fought with brutal efficiency, all power and experience. Hadrian fought like water, flowing around strikes and finding openings where none should exist. Then Vachel did something Natalie didn't see clearly, some trick with his blade or his movement, and suddenly he was inside Hadrian's guard with his sword at Hadrian's throat. The courtyard went silent. Submit, Vachel said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Accept that your judgment is compromised and step down. Through the bond, Natalie felt Hadrian's absolute calm, felt him calculating angles and possibilities, felt the moment he made his decision. He moved faster than her eyes could track, dropping low and sweeping Vachel's legs while simultaneously knocking the sword away from his throat. They went down in a tangle of limbs and blades, rolling across the white stone, and when they separated, both were bleeding heavily. But Hadrian was faster to his feet, and his blade found Vachel's chest before the older vampire could recover. Not a killing blow, not yet, but positioned perfectly over his heart, ready to strike if Vachel moved. I submit to nothing, Hadrian said, quiet and cold. My judgment is sound, my claim is valid, and you, Vachel, have lost. For a long moment no one moved. Then Vachel's sword clattered to the stone, and he raised one hand in surrender. I yield. The sound from Hadrian's supporters was deafening. Natalie was on her feet, not remembering standing, the bond singing with Hadrian's relief and triumph and exhaustion. He withdrew his blade and stepped back, offering Vashel a hand up in a gesture of respect that made some of the neutral vampires nod approval. Vashel took the hand, let Hadrian pull him to his feet. "Well fought," he said grudgingly. "Perhaps your judgment isn't so compromised after all. Perhaps you should have considered that before issuing challenge." A slight smile from Vashel. "Perhaps." Then Hadrian was crossing the courtyard to Natalie, and she was running to meet him halfway. Propriety be damned. He caught her in his arms and held her so tightly she couldn't breathe, blood and all, and through the bond she felt his absolute certainty that this moment, this woman, was worth every wound and every challenge and every century of loneliness that had come before. "You won," she said unnecessarily. "I had a very good reason to win." He kissed her properly in front of both courts, making absolutely clear what that reason was. The formal investiture happened a week later, after Hadrian had fully healed, and the court had processed the outcome of the challenge. It was held in the same circular chamber where Vashel had issued his challenge, but the atmosphere was completely different, celebratory rather than tense, vampires in formal attire drinking wine that probably cost more than cars. Natalie wore a gown that Mira and several others had created specifically for the occasion, deep midnight blue with silver embroidery that matched the ring on her finger. Her hair was swept up in an elaborate style woven through with more of those strange crystals, and when she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw a queen staring back. Through the bond, she felt Hadrian's approval, his pride, his overwhelming love. He was already in the chamber waiting, and she could sense his anticipation thrumming between them. Lucian escorted her down the aisle between the seated vampires, and the murmurs that rose weren't hostile this time. They were appreciative, curious, welcoming. She kept her head high and her steps steady, and when she reached Hadrian at the front of the chamber, he took her hand and raised it to his lips. "Ready?" he murmured. "For what?" "To become officially, formally, impossibly mine." She smiled. "I think we covered that in the binding ceremony. That was personal. This is political." He turned to face the court, keeping her hand in his. "We are here to formally recognize and celebrate the completed bond between myself and Natalie Ellis. She has accepted my claim, undergone the binding ritual, and proven herself worthy of standing beside me." He gestured to Mira, who came forward carrying a cushion. On it sat a crown delicate and beautiful, designed to complement the ring Natalie already wore. Hadrian lifted the crown with both hands. "This was commissioned 400 years ago for a queen who never materialized. I've kept it in storage, waiting for someone worthy of wearing it. Natalie." He looked at her, and she felt his love and certainty through the bond like a physical force. "You are far worthier than I could have imagined. Will you accept this crown and the responsibilities it represents? Will you stand as queen, not just bound to me, but partner in rule?" The chamber was absolutely silent. Every vampire present was watching her, waiting for her answer. Natalie thought about the woman she'd been 4 days ago, standing in a courthouse corridor, trying to hurt herself to comply with her ex-husband's demands. That woman felt like a stranger now, small and diminished. The woman she was now had chosen a vampire king, survived supernatural politics, stood before an entire court, and demanded to be heard. This woman could absolutely wear a crown. "I accept," she said clearly. "The crown, the responsibilities, the partnership, all of it." Hadrian's smile was radiant. He placed the crown on her head with careful reverence, and the moment it settled into place, Natalie felt something shift in the bond, not stronger, exactly, but deeper, more fundamental, like the universe was acknowledging this new reality and adjusting accordingly. The court erupted in applause. Hadrian pulled her close and kissed her like they weren't standing in front of 60 vampires, and through the bond she felt his absolute contentment, his deep certainty that this was exactly how things were meant to be. When they finally broke apart, he kept her close and addressed the court again. "I present to you Queen Natalie, bound and crowned, mine and her own. May she rule with wisdom, and may those who underestimate her learn better quickly." More applause, genuine and sustained. Several vampires approached to offer formal congratulations, including Vashel, who bowed with actual respect and said, "I'm glad I was wrong about your judgment, my lord." Seraphine appeared near the end, devastating in emerald green. She looked at Natalie for a long moment, then smiled genuine warmth instead of calculated charm. "You're good for him," she said simply. "Don't let him brood too much. He has a tendency toward melodrama when left to his own devices." "I'll keep that in mind." Seraphine leaned closer, lowering her voice. "And if you ever need advice on managing stubborn vampire kings, you know where to find me." "In Paris?" "Among other places." She brushed a kiss to Natalie's cheek, nodded to Hadrian, and disappeared into the crowd. The celebration went late into the night, vampires dancing and drinking and toasting the new queen. Natalie found herself enjoying it, despite the surreal nature of being the center of attention in a vampire court. Hadrian stayed close, introducing her to allies and explaining complicated political relationships, and through the bond, she could feel his pride every time she handled an interaction with grace. Finally, as dawn approached and the vampires began seeking shelter from the coming sun, Hadrian led her away from the chamber toward the private quarters they now shared. "How do you feel?" he asked as they climbed the familiar stairs. "Tired, happy, slightly overwhelmed." She leaned against him, letting him take some of her weight. "Also, like I just became royalty to a society of immortal blood drinkers, which is objectively insane." "Objectively," he agreed. "But are you regretting it?" She stopped on the landing and turned to face him properly. The crown was still on her head, the ring still on her finger, and through the bond she could feel his love and uncertainty mixing together. "Not even a little bit," she said. 4 days ago, I was trying to get Marcus's ring off my finger in a courthouse corridor. Now I'm wearing a crown and bound to a vampire king and completely certain this is exactly where I'm supposed to be. If that's not magic, I don't know what is." Hadrian cupped her face in both hands, that cool touch she'd come to crave. "I love you. Impossibly, completely, forever." "Forever," she agreed. "That's what the bond means, right?" "Longer if I have anything to say about it." She laughed and kissed him, and he swept her up in his arms and carried her the rest of the way to their chambers, like they were in some gothic romance novel. Maybe they were. Maybe she'd stumbled into a fairy tale without realizing it, the kind where the prince was actually a king and also a vampire, and saving her meant letting her save herself first. The future stretched out ahead of them, vast and full of possibility. Eventually, she'd probably transition to vampire fully, gain the immortality and power that came with it. Eventually, she'd learn to navigate vampire politics without Hadrian having to guide her. Eventually, this would all feel normal, instead of beautifully strange. But tonight, in their chambers with dawn breaking outside and the bond humming contentedly between them, Natalie let herself just be grateful. Grateful that Marcus had demanded his ring back in that courthouse corridor. Grateful that Hadrian had been there to intervene. Grateful for every impossible thing that had followed. Her ex-husband had demanded she return a ring. The vampire king had given her a crown instead. And somehow, against every odd and expectation, that had turned out to be exactly what she needed. Hadrian laid her on their bed and followed her down, kissing her slow and deep, and through the bond she felt his contentment mixing with her own, until she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. "My queen," he murmured against her lips. "My king," she answered, and meant it with everything she was. Outside the window the sun rose on a new day, but in their chambers the curtains were drawn against the light, creating a space where time felt suspended, where a human woman and a vampire king could simply exist together, bound and crowned, and impossibly happy. Marcus sent one final text that morning, something angry and demanding and completely irrelevant. Natalie deleted it without reading and turned off her phone. That life was over. This one vampire politics and eternal love and learning to be a queen was just beginning, and she was ready for absolutely all of it.